Trigger warning. This video mentions blood, sexual content, and invasion of privacy. If any of those subjects are distressing, please take care as you listen. They began as ordinary Reddit posts. Small, believable reports from people in houses, apartments, and fields. Each one started with a single odd detail: a cluster of Wi-Fi names over a backyard slab, a strange stain on an apartment wall, a missing sock and a tooth on a bedroom floor, a manhole under a bridge that led to something the boys did not expect. Taken alone, any of those details could be dismissed. Taken together, they become windows you can't unsee. These are 4 threads that grew into slow, communal investigations, and none of them closes neatly. Story 1 began on April 21, 2016, on a Hawaiian subreddit where someone with a Wi-Fi analyzer noticed something off. The poster described standing on their lanai and watching their phone light up with SSIDs, not a few, but 20-plus networks clustered over a particular patch of ground, a circular concrete pad behind a neighboring property. The networks would appear, then rotate, then come back. Every 5 minutes, new names. Every 5 minutes, the same signal strength centered on the same point. They ran a simple diagnostic, a heat map from a Wi-Fi scanning app. The heat concentrated like a bruise on a map, centered precisely over that concrete slab. Someone suggested using a thermal camera. The poster obliged. A grainy thermal image revealed what looked like a warm spot in the middle of the pad, a small area consistently hotter than the surrounding ground, even in the evening air. Curious commenters recommended basic probes: pour water to see if it drained, tap the slab to test its thickness. The poster did both. The water vanished into a seam near the center. A quick inspection with a garden trowel and a borrowed hammer yielded a small chip in the slab, but when they pried deeper, the concrete was unusually dense, mixed with river rock, and poured thicker than a typical patio. Under a thin ring of gravel, the poster found a dark conduit leading away, partially visible where it entered a strip of soil toward the neighbor's fence. People on the thread started connecting dots. Someone with an interest in urban exploration noted the pattern of rotating SSIDs. Could be multiple small devices broadcasting different names to mask a central transmitter. Another commenter, more technical, said the consistent signal strength pointed to a single source with a directional antenna. A few users threw out speculative, more fantastical connections, old conspiracy theories, and a long-debunked net of ideas that had circulated for years. One name kept surfacing in the comments, an eBay handle that a few users claimed had turned up in other related listings. Che Bay, spelled like that in the thread. Some suggested the handle might be a pseudonym tied to equipment sales. Others wondered whether the handle was a coincidence. The poster reported follow-ups over the next week. A friend with a soil auger hit something that created a hollow sound, as if there were a cavity below. When they ran a metal detector, it beeped faintly along a line that matched the conduit. Someone in the comments recommended calling a utility company. The poster said they did call, and the company's representative told them there were no municipal installations in that exact spot. That made the thread go cold in the way threads do. Half the people lost interest, others dug deeper. As users dug, more images surfaced. A macro photo of tiny, identical screw heads embedded along the pad's perimeter, a night shot with flash that showed a faint circular discoloration in the soil. The community started piecing together possibilities: an old service access, a privately installed equipment cache, a drainage for an older structure, or the sort of makeshift cell of devices used by people experimenting with wireless for unusual purposes. A few users invoked larger conspiracies by name, some even pointing to past internet scares, like the so-called Pizzagate rumors. Those suggestions were flagged by others as speculative and unproven. Moderators reminded readers that connecting the pad to high-level conspiracies required evidence the thread did not have. At the edge of the discussion, a line of sympathy and skepticism formed. A commenter who claimed to be the poster's ex-boss offered a different view. He described the original poster as someone prone to anxiety and, at times, to seeing patterns that weren't there. Several people in the thread noted the poster's known struggles with mental health, adding a careful caveat that such reports were unverified and not an explanation for the physical oddities. The thread, in short, became both an investigation and a debate over how to interpret limited data. Was it a benign, improvised installation for radio experiments, an abandoned infrastructure element, or something intentionally hidden beneath a slab that otherwise served as a backyard feature? The unsettling thing that threaded through the whole conversation was surveillance by implication. A cluster of SSIDs and a warm spot suggest not simply a device, but ongoing activity, something that can be turned on, rotated, and possibly monitored. Whether that activity was technical hobbyism, a private antenna, or something more intrusive, the poster never produced definitive proof. The conduit could not be fully traced without professional excavation. The eBay handle remained circumstantial at best. Some users found similar names in unrelated sales, others saw nothing worth connecting. And then, as often happens on the internet, the post went quiet. The original account stopped responding to questions. The thread dwindled to archival screenshots and lingering what-ifs. Community curiosity had pushed the small patch of concrete into a place where ordinary geography and suspected secrecy overlapped. The pad stayed a pad. The SSIDs likely remained ephemeral. For those who followed the thread, the real chill wasn't an underground machine revealed or a villain unmasked. It was the idea that right under a backyard, where laundry dries and children play, something could be broadcasting, rotating, unseen, and unaccounted for. If that made you uneasy, wait until you hear the second story. On December 16, 2025, a different subreddit received a photograph. It was a close-up, flatly lit picture of a section of apartment wall, a roughly circular mark of a darker color, a small chip in the plaster beneath it, and a faint arc of discoloration on the floor. The poster wrote a one-line caption, "How do I clean this? Renter here." The image went up with no explanation, and because the poster's account showed a pattern of candid, occasionally self-deprecating domestic posts, many assumed it was some sort of spilled paint or a drunken accident. Then people began to look more carefully. The mark didn't look like a conventional spill. Its edges were too defined, almost geometric. The chip in the wall sat just below, at shoulder height, relative to where a person standing someone's kitchen might be, and there was a thin smear that suggested a glancing impact rather than a flat smear. Commenters with paramedic or cleaning experience weighed in. Certain shapes often indicate forceful contact, they cautioned. Spray patterns tend to look different from a single impact followed by pooling. The poster's history fed the unease. Past comments on neighborhood subthreads mentioned heavy drinking and a recent breakup. Not long after the photo, an account claiming to be a local neighbor said they had heard raised voices from the apartment the night before. Moderators removed that comment for privacy reasons. Other users noticed that the poster had blocked several people who asked for details, and that the original message had been later deleted and re-uploaded in cropped form. Those developments moved the thread from curiosity to suspicion. If the mark was the result of an injury, was it accidental? Was the poster cleaning up after themselves or covering up evidence? Users debated tone and ethics more than they argued the facts. One camp urged restraint. Mistakes happen, and people with messy lives do not equal criminals. Another camp urged that the pattern, image, deletion, evasiveness looked like a deliberate attempt to obscure something. A small group of users examined the photo's metadata and surface lighting. Their analysis suggested the photo had been edited to hide parts of the scene. A moderator intervened again, notifying the poster that if there was a safety concern, they should report it to local authorities. The poster responded with a curt line, "It's fine now, calm down," and then went silent. Like the concrete pad, this story did not conclude with official confirmation or arrest. It closed with a half-dozen people left, wondering whether they had witnessed the edges of a serious event or just the messy fallout of a private life. For many, the image refused to sit neatly in either category. The ordinary interior, a rented apartment, a worn sofa, a chipped wall, had been transformed into an ambiguous scene where context was missing and motive was unknowable. The uncertainty was the wound you kept picking at long after the thread dropped off the front page. Next came a longer, more intimate thread that unfurled in pieces, and then, more disturbingly, in items. The post's author went by a handle that the community referred to as "Random Girl to You." She started with small complaints: missing underwear, a few odd impressions on the ceiling of her bedroom, a tooth on her floor, a single tooth, inexplicably, pushed her from irritation to alarm. She described how she inspected the attic access and found it latched in a way that suggested it had been opened from the inside. Her recounting read like the slow discovery of a violation. At first, it was petty theft. One pair of missing socks, a towel gone. Then she found more personal items tucked into corners of the attic, a beer can with a koozie from a local bar she frequented, clothing she recognized, and a collection of small jars. She posted photos, not graphic, but intimate in their implications, of jars, tissues, and objects stored with alarming intent. Several users who knew the neighborhood recognized a detail. The attic was accessible from a crawl space that a neighbor could reach with a ladder placed against a certain section of siding. Someone suggested checking security camera footage. She said there were no cameras. Comments poured in with a mix of outrage and horror. How long had someone been watching? How intimate could their collection be? Several contributors urged immediate involvement of law enforcement. She said she called and that police dusted and lifted prints, but she never posted an official police report. Some users later claimed they had seen an officer at the house. Others said they had seen no official response recorded publicly. The story shifted when she wrote tentatively that she suspected a trusted neighbor, a 70-year-old deacon from the local church, because he had access to her property through a rarely used gate and had always seemed overly solicitous. Several commenters pushed back hard, warning against naming a private individual online. The poster herself stopped short of explicit accusation, framing the suspicion as something she could not reconcile with the man's public persona. He was a community volunteer, someone people would not expect. The attic thread became a reckoning about who we allow access to our lives. Users shared experience after experience, elderly neighbors who behaved oddly, volunteers who loved the sound of their own generosity, people whose faces and reputations hid more complicated patterns. Many voices in the thread emphasized empathy for the poster. Others, more procedural, urged collecting evidence and using official channels, not mob accusation. The poster, understandably distressed, posted sparse updates. I found another jar. I found underwear. I found a note that wasn't mine. Each post pulled the community deeper into a narrative of betrayal that felt both ordinary and monstrous. Law enforcement action, as reported in the thread, was ambiguous. There were mentions of prints being compared, of officers taking items away in evidence bags, but the thread never culminated in the sort of public confirmation that would close the loop. No press release, no arrest report in local news that could be easily linked back to the account's timeline. Over time, the poster's replies became fewer. A few months later, she posted a message about moving away and requested privacy. People who followed the thread afterward mourned that the story had no neat justice. The horror in this thread wasn't a single shocking reveal so much as the slow, ongoing trespass. Someone inhabiting her privacy for months and leaving behind trophies of their intrusion. The way the community responded to the attic story is revealing of the internet's double role. On the one hand, the thread provided solidarity and practical suggestions. On the other, it risked naming and shaming a private person without judicial outcome, a hazard the moderators and many users tried to navigate carefully, repeatedly reminding each other to avoid defamatory claims and to leave room for law enforcement to do its work. In these moments, the internet can be both protector and predator. It can bring people together to document a wrong, and, without evidence that meets legal thresholds, it can also amplify rumor. The final post we'll look at comes from a rural place. Boys on a dare, a bridge, and a manhole they pried loose with a screwdriver. It was the kind of thing teenagers do, bored, daring each other to go where adults seldom do. They lifted the heavy round lid, shouted into the dark and climbed down. The crawl into the shaft was long and wet and claustrophobic. At the far end, the boys found a small concrete chamber. A single foldable chair sat facing a slabbed wall. On that wall was a torn page from a magazine, an erotic image, eyes cut carefully from the faces. On the floor was a condom, stained and discarded. No one in the thread described the scene in lurid detail. The boys themselves posted a shaky photo and a short caption. "We found this. Should we tell someone?" The post exploded with comments that ranged from schoolyard bravado to sober alarm. Several people urged them to contact the police immediately. The boys said later that they panicked and left. One of them, in a later private message shared with a user who offered to help, confessed they had returned twice to look, but always found the chamber empty, as if whatever belonged to that space had been moved or hidden after their first visit. That ambiguity gnawed at commenters. Some wrote about rural rituals and creepy hoarding projects that, while unpleasant, were not necessarily criminal. Others suggested a darker interpretation, a stage site for violence or a private place for someone with compulsive, possibly dangerous behavior. The condom was the most unsettling piece of evidence because, while it indicates the presence of sexual activity, it says nothing about consent. In discussions around such findings, commenters repeatedly advised the boys to tell a parent or call the police, emphasizing safety over curiosity. The boys' silence after their initial posts mattered. They did not report the find to authorities, at least not publicly on the thread, and when users pushed them for more information, they folded. That decision left the scene in limbo, a staged tableau that could be the work of a solitary kink, a ritualized display, or evidence of something more violent. In the absence of follow-up, the community's theories proliferated. Some even suggested that the torn eyes were an attempt at anonymity, a way to strip the faces of identity in a photograph. Others thought it was an aesthetic of cruelty, an act meant to unsettle whoever might stumble upon it. Across all four stories, the pattern is the same. Ordinary places, a backyard slab, an apartment wall, an attic above a bedroom, the underside of a rural bridge, become sites of intrusion. The internet becomes both microscope and rumor mill. Users bring technical knowledge, emotional support, and, sometimes, dangerous speculation. A few themes recur in the thread's language: the strain of unfinished evidence, the human need for closure, and the temptation to fill gaps with narrative. One of the hardest decisions in following these threads is how to treat evidence that is both evocative and partial. A thermal image, a flicker of signal strength, a photograph with a small chip. They feel like clues. They also feel fragile, easy to misread, easy to edit, easy to be spoken about in the absence of true context. The safest thing the internet can do, and the thing that often feels unsatisfying, is to document and press for accountability while acknowledging uncertainty. Speculation can help focus an investigation. It can also create a perimeter of rumor that traps innocent people and terrifies survivors. There are ethical pressures here too. When a poster suggests that someone may have mental health problems, the community tended to repeat it cautiously, reported by the poster, alleged history, unverified. That restraint matters. Mental illness is not a crime. Mentioning it without context risks reinforcing stigma and drawing lines that confuse cause and culpability. The threads that swirl around suspicion and diagnosis show how quickly online communities can conflate behavior, disorder, and criminality. And yet, the emotional center of each of these posts is straightforward. Someone's personal space has been breached in a way that mattered to them. The poster of the concrete pad felt surveilled. The renter with the wall photo feared something ugly had happened in their home. The woman who found the attic collections suffered a long, intimate violation that rewrote her sense of safety. The boys under the bridge saw evidence that made their countryside seem less innocent. For those who read these threads, the haunting comes from both the images and the gaps. The images establish a scene, the gaps ask you to imagine the rest. The longer these stories linger without resolution, the more the imagination fills in the blanks in the worst ways. You feel obligated to choose between plausible explanations and monstrous ones, and that indecision is its own kind of terror. If there is a functional lesson at the heart of this collection, it is a practical one. When you find something unsettling online, document what you can without putting yourself at risk, and consider contacting local authorities. If you are the person posting a distressing discovery, remember that the internet can be helpful and harmful at once. Preserve evidence, avoid naming private individuals publicly, and whenever possible, involve professionals who can act within the law. If you are a member of an online community, strive for compassion first and sober skepticism second. Demand evidence, but do not deny the pain of the person who has shared their experience. These 4 threads remain unresolved in different ways, none of them closed, with a neat confirmation that would let the community exhale. The concrete pad was a technical curiosity that suggested hidden activity, but yielded no excavation. The blood on the wall was an image of a private stain, and a poster's evasive behavior that might indicate mess or malfeasance. We don't know. The attic housed personal violations that the poster documented with courage, but that did not resolve into public adjudication. The manhole under the bridge contained a staging that teenagers stumbled upon, and their silence left it to rumor. Perhaps that's the most modern kind of haunting, not the definitive horror of a single monstrous act, but the persistent awareness that our ordinary spaces are porous. Walls, attics, and manholes do not feel like threats until someone proves they are. But for the people who found those proofs, or think they did, the feeling lingers. The internet amplifies this unease by recording fragments, hosting collective analysis, and preserving unanswered questions indefinitely. If you've followed this far, you've seen how small anomalies can expand into sustained unease. If you love deep dives into internet mysteries, subscribe. I've got more. Before I go, a quick note about rumors. When threads link to bigger conspiracies, like decades-old internet scares, treat those connections as community speculation unless there is demonstrable evidence. And if you see something that looks like a crime, consider contacting authorities instead of relying solely on an anonymous forum. Professionals can collect the kind of evidence that makes a real difference. Share your own creepy Reddit finds in the comments, and if anything like this has happened to you or someone you know, please contact local authorities. Don't keep it to yourself. Ordinary places are safer when we look out for one another, and sometimes the smallest detail is the clue that helps solve a mystery.